The Soviet guards were told to watch Marilyn Monroe, but nobody had warned them about what would happen when she looked back at them. It was a freezing morning in Moscow. The streets were crowded. Soldiers stood at the edges of the road. Government officials waited in silence. And behind the barriers, thousands of ordinary Soviet citizens had gathered. They had been told that an American visitor was arriving, but they had not been prepared for her. A black automobile slowly stopped. The door opened, and then Marilyn Monroe stepped out. For several seconds, the entire street became silent. No cheering, no applause, nothing. Just thousands of people staring at the woman they had seen only on cinema screens. The blonde hair, the famous face, the unmistakable figure. Marilyn looked at the crowd. Then she looked at the soldiers. Then back at the people. And something in her expression changed, because she suddenly realized something terrifying. These people weren't just looking at Marilyn Monroe. They were looking at America. And in the middle of the Cold War, that made her far more powerful than she had ever imagined. The year was 1959. The world was divided between two superpowers, America and the Soviet Union. Neither side trusted the other. Both sides watched each other's movements. Both sides feared what the other might do next. The Iron Curtain wasn't simply a border. It was an idea, a wall between two different worlds. And people on both sides had been taught to believe that the other side was dangerous. Americans saw the Soviet Union as a threat. Soviet citizens had their own picture of America. But there was one thing neither government could completely control: human curiosity. And Marilyn Monroe represented everything people were curious about: Hollywood, fame, American movies, American fashion, American glamour, the American dream. She was not a politician. She carried no weapons. She had no diplomatic title. But she possessed something that could be even more powerful during the Cold War. Millions of eyes followed her. And now those eyes were following her into Moscow. Marilyn stood beside the automobile. A Soviet official approached. He looked serious, very serious. He spoke to the translator. "Tell her she must remain close to the security detail." The translator nodded, then turned toward Marilyn. Marilyn looked at him. "What did he say?" "He wants you to stay close." Marilyn glanced at the soldiers surrounding her. Then she looked at the crowd. "Why?" "For your safety." Marilyn smiled faintly. "From them?" The translator didn't answer. Marilyn looked again. There were mothers holding children, old men wearing heavy coats, young women whispering to one another, teenagers trying to get a better look at her. A little boy was standing on his father's shoulders. None of them looked dangerous. They looked curious, almost fascinated. Marilyn lowered her voice. "They don't look like enemies." The translator stared at her. He knew that sentence was harmless, but he also knew how dangerous simple words could become in a place like this. The automobile began moving. Marilyn sat beside the window, and she watched Moscow. She had expected something colder, something darker, something almost frightening. Instead, she saw ordinary life: a woman carrying groceries, a father holding his daughter's hand, workers walking quickly through the streets, children playing, a young couple talking, an old man reading a newspaper. Marilyn watched silently. Then she asked, "Do they know who I am?" "Yes." "All of them?" "Many of them." She smiled. "That's strange." "What is strange?" Marilyn looked outside. "They know my face." She paused. "But they don't know me." The translator didn't respond. Marilyn continued watching the city, and suddenly the thought became uncomfortable.
Maybe that was true everywhere.
Millions of people knew Marilyn Monroe, but very few knew the woman behind the photograph. They knew the blonde, they knew the smile, they knew the voice, they knew the movies, they knew the fantasy. But they didn't know the girl who had grown up without the security of a normal childhood. They didn't know the woman who sometimes felt painfully alone despite being surrounded by people. They didn't know how exhausting it could be to live inside an image that belonged to the entire world. Marilyn turned toward the window. For the first time, she wondered what would happen if she entered a place where nobody expected her to be Marilyn. When the automobile finally stopped, a crowd was already waiting. Hundreds, then thousands. The noise grew louder. Marilyn stepped out. People began calling her name. "Marilyn! Marilyn!" She looked stunned. A woman near the front began crying. Marilyn noticed. She pointed toward her.
Why is she crying?
The translator spoke to the woman, then he smiled. "She says she never believed she would see you." Marilyn looked at the woman. Her expression softened. She walked toward her. Security immediately moved forward. "Stay back!" Marilyn stopped, then looked at the official. "She's crying." The official said nothing. Marilyn turned back toward the woman, and slowly she reached out her hand. The woman took it. Neither understood the other's language. They didn't need to. Marilyn squeezed her hand. The woman began crying harder. Marilyn smiled, then whispered, "It's okay." The translator translated. The woman nodded. For a moment, the entire crowd became silent. No politics, no America, no Soviet Union, no Cold War. Just two women holding hands. And perhaps nobody in that street understood how extraordinary that moment was. But someone did. A Soviet official standing several meters away. He had been watching Marilyn since the moment she arrived.
He wasn't interested in her beauty. He wasn't interested in her movies.
He wasn't even particularly interested in the crowd. He was watching what Marilyn was doing to the crowd, and what he saw worried him. People were smiling. They were approaching her. They were laughing. They were crying. They were forgetting for a moment that she was supposed to represent the enemy. That was the danger. Because propaganda could tell people what to fear. But one human interaction could destroy years of fear in seconds. The official turned to another man. "Keep her under observation." The man asked, "Why?" The official looked toward Marilyn. "Because she doesn't understand what she represents." Later that day, Marilyn visited a theater. She walked through a narrow backstage corridor. Actors and performers watched her nervously. Some whispered, some smiled. One young woman stood completely frozen. Marilyn noticed her. She approached. "What's wrong?" The translator explained.
She is nervous.
Marilyn laughed softly. "So am I." The young woman looked shocked. "You?" Marilyn nodded. "Always." The translator translated. The woman smiled, and Marilyn took her hand. "You'll be wonderful." The young actress looked at her. Then Marilyn said something quietly. "Don't be afraid of the audience." She paused. "Just be yourself." The translator repeated the words. The young woman nodded, and Marilyn walked away. But the young actress kept watching her, because she had just discovered something the world rarely saw. The woman who seemed fearless was afraid too. The woman everyone considered perfect wasn't perfect at all. And perhaps that was why she felt so human. That evening, Marilyn was taken to a large hall. Hundreds of Soviet citizens were waiting. She walked onto the stage. The applause was immediate. But Marilyn didn't smile. She looked at the faces, young, old, rich, poor, curious, confused, hopeful.
And suddenly, she realized what they were waiting for.
They didn't simply want to see an actress. They wanted to see the person behind the image. She stepped toward the microphone. "I know many of you have seen me in movies." The translator repeated her words. The room became quiet. Marilyn looked around. "But I've never seen you." A few people smiled. She continued. "So I came here," she paused, "to see you." Silence. For one heartbeat. 2, 3. Then someone began clapping. One person. Then another. Then 10. Then hundreds. The entire hall erupted. Marilyn stood completely still, her eyes filled with tears. She looked down, and when she looked back up, the famous smile was gone. Instead, there was something much more vulnerable, something real. She whispered, "Thank you." The translator repeated it. The applause became even louder, and Marilyn suddenly understood something. She had spent years performing for people who already believed they knew her, but here, behind the Iron Curtain, strangers were beginning to see her as a human being. And that touched something inside her that fame never could. But while the audience applauded, someone backstage was already making a phone call. A Soviet official spoke quietly. "She is asking too many questions." A voice answered through the telephone. "What kind of questions?" "About ordinary people." A pause. "Anything political?" "No." "Then why are you concerned?" The official looked through the doorway at Marilyn. "She doesn't seem interested in politics." Another pause. "Then what does she want?" The official watched Marilyn laughing with several performers. Finally, he answered, "She wants to understand them." Silence. Then the voice on the telephone said, "Don't let her get too close." That night, Marilyn returned to her hotel. She closed the door. The room was dark. She removed her coat, then her gloves. Then she stood in front of the mirror. For a long moment, she simply stared at herself. The woman in the mirror looked like Marilyn Monroe, but she didn't feel like Marilyn Monroe. She touched her face, then whispered, "Who are they really seeing?" She knew the answer. They were seeing the image, the blonde bombshell, the Hollywood star, the American dream. But the woman beneath all of it was tired. She wanted something the world could never buy her. To be loved without performing. To be understood without explaining. To be seen without being photographed. She sat beside the window. Outside, Moscow was glowing beneath the night sky. Thousands of windows, thousands of lives, thousands of people she would never know. Marilyn watched them. Then she whispered, "They're just like us." She smiled sadly. They just don't know it. Then came the knock. 3 slow knocks. Marilyn froze. She looked toward the door. Nothing. Then 3 more. Her translator entered the room. He looked nervous. "Who is it?" Marilyn asked. He didn't answer. "Who?" Finally, he whispered, "Government officials." Marilyn stood. "What do they want?" The translator looked at the door, then back at her. "They want to speak with you." "About the theater?" "No." "About the crowd?" "No." Marilyn's face changed. "Then what?" The translator lowered his voice. "They want to know what you really think about the Soviet Union." Marilyn stared at the door. For the first time since arriving in Moscow, She felt completely alone, because she suddenly understood. Every smile had been watched, every question had been recorded, every conversation had been noticed. And now someone wanted to know what was inside her head. Marilyn slowly walked toward the door. Her hand reached for the handle. She stopped, took one breath, and whispered, "I came here to see them." Then she looked at the door. Now they want to know what I saw. She opened it.
And on the other side stood a man who had one question for Marilyn Monroe, a question that could turn her entire journey into a political storm. "Miss Monroe." The door opened. Marilyn Monroe stood face to face with a Soviet official she had never met. He didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself immediately. He simply looked at her as if he were trying to see through the woman the entire world thought it knew. Behind Marilyn, the hotel room was silent. Outside the window, Moscow disappeared into darkness. The official finally spoke. "Miss Monroe, may I come in?" Marilyn looked at her translator, then back at the man. "Yes." He stepped inside. The door closed. And suddenly, the most famous woman in America was alone in a room with a representative of the government that America had spent years calling its greatest enemy. The official sat down. Marilyn remained standing. He looked at her. "You have been asking many questions." Marilyn smiled faintly. "I like questions." "About our people?" "Yes." "Why?" Marilyn thought for a moment. "Because I came here to meet them." The official leaned back. "You came here as an American?" Marilyn nodded. "Yes." "You understand that many people see you as a symbol of America?" She sighed. "I know." "Then everything you say can be interpreted politically." Marilyn looked directly at him. "That sounds exhausting." For the first time, the official almost smiled. Almost. Then his expression became serious again. "Tell me what you think of the Soviet Union." Marilyn was silent. This was the moment. She could say what everyone expected. She could praise the country. She could criticize it. She could avoid the question. Instead, she looked toward the window. "I don't know enough to judge your country." The official frowned. "But you have seen our people." "Yes." "What do you think of them?" Marilyn turned toward him. "They're people." The official stared. Marilyn continued. "They laugh. They cry. They get nervous. They fall in love. They worry about their children." She paused. "Just like Americans." The room became silent. The official looked at her carefully. "You believe Americans and Soviets are the same?" Marilyn shook her head. "No," she smiled. "I believe they're human." That answer was simple, but in the middle of the Cold War, simple could be dangerous. The official changed the subject. "Do you think Americans understand the Soviet people?" Marilyn laughed quietly. "I don't think Americans understand Americans." The translator almost smiled. The official didn't. "You are avoiding the question." "No." Marilyn looked at him. "I'm answering it." The official leaned forward. "What have you learned since you arrived?" Marilyn thought about the little girl with the flower, the young actress backstage, the people in the theater, the woman who had cried when she held Marilyn's hand. Then she said, "I learned that fear makes strangers look different." The official said nothing. Marilyn continued. "When you don't know someone, you can imagine anything about them." She paused. "But when you meet them," her voice softened, "they become a person." The official looked away. For a moment, Marilyn thought the conversation was over. It wasn't. He asked another question. Do you believe America is better than the Soviet Union? Marilyn stared at him, then smiled. I believe America is my home. And that means it is better? No. The answer came instantly. It means it's mine. The official was silent. Marilyn continued. Your country belongs to your people. She looked around the room. My country belongs to mine. Then she said, maybe people don't have to hate each other just because governments disagree. The translator stopped. He looked at Marilyn, then at the official. He slowly translated the sentence. Nobody spoke. The next morning, the story had already begun spreading. People had seen Marilyn in Moscow. They had seen her smiling. They had seen her holding the hands of ordinary citizens. They had seen her laughing with performers. And now people wanted to see her again. Crowds began appearing outside the places she visited. Some carried photographs. Others carried flowers. Some simply stood there. They didn't know what she would say. They didn't know why she had come. But they wanted to see her. Marilyn stepped outside. The crowd reacted immediately. She waved. Then she noticed something. A young man standing near the back was holding a piece of paper. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't pushing forward. He was simply watching. Marilyn pointed toward him. Who is he? The translator looked. I don't know. Bring him here. Security hesitated, but Marilyn insisted. The young man was brought forward. He was nervous. Marilyn smiled. What is your name? The translator translated. The young man answered. Marilyn repeated his name. She pronounced it incorrectly. Everyone laughed, even Marilyn. She put a hand over her mouth. I'm sorry. The young man smiled. Then he said something. The translator listened. What did he say? The translator smiled. He says he has seen your movies. Marilyn laughed. Of course he has. Then the young man asked a question. The translator became quiet. Marilyn noticed. What? He wants to know if America is really like your movies. Marilyn smiled, then shook her head. No. The young man looked surprised. Marilyn continued. Sometimes it's beautiful. She paused. Sometimes it's lonely. Another pause. And sometimes, she looked at the crowd, it's just ordinary. The young man nodded. Then Marilyn asked him, What about here? He looked at the translator, then answered. The translator smiled. He says it's the same. Marilyn laughed, and the crowd laughed with her. For one brief moment, the Iron Curtain didn't exist. But the Soviet government was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The problem wasn't that Marilyn was saying something openly hostile. The problem was the opposite. She was saying things that made people think. She was making Soviet citizens curious about Americans, and she was making Americans curious about Soviets. She wasn't delivering propaganda. She was destroying it. Not with speeches, with human contact, with smiles, with questions, with simple conversations. And that was harder to control. Later that day, Marilyn visited another theater. The young actress she had met earlier was preparing for her performance. Marilyn watched from backstage. The actress was shaking. Marilyn approached. Still nervous? The woman nodded. Marilyn smiled. Good. The actress looked confused. Marilyn laughed. If you're nervous, it means you care. The translator repeated the words. The young woman smiled. Marilyn touched her shoulder. Go out there. The actress walked toward the stage. The lights came on, music began, and she performed. Marilyn watched. At the end, the audience erupted in applause. The young actress returned backstage crying. Marilyn hugged her. The woman whispered something. What did she say? Marilyn asked. The translator answered. She says,
She will never forget you." Marilyn's eyes became wet. She replied, "Tell her I won't forget her either." The translator translated. They hugged again. And for Marilyn, that moment meant more than any Hollywood premiere ever had. Because nobody was asking her to be beautiful. Nobody was asking her to perform. Nobody was asking her to smile for a camera. She was simply Marilyn. And that was enough. That night, she returned to her hotel. She sat beside the window. The city was quiet. She thought about America. She thought about Moscow. She thought about the people she had met. Then she picked up a piece of paper. She began writing. Not a speech, not a political statement, a letter. She wrote about the woman who had cried when she saw her, the little girl with the flower, the young actress backstage, the people who had asked about America. She wrote, "They are not so different from us." Then she stopped. She stared at the sentence and slowly crossed it out. She wrote another. "Maybe we are all more alike than we think." She looked at it, then smiled. Suddenly, the telephone rang. Marilyn froze. She looked at it. 1 ring. 2. 3. She picked it up. "Hello?" No answer. "Hello?" Silence. Then a man's voice. "Miss Monroe." Marilyn sat upright. "Yes?" "You should be careful about what you say." Her expression changed. "Who is this?" The line went dead. Marilyn slowly lowered the telephone. Her heart was beating faster. The room suddenly felt different. She looked toward the door, then toward the window. She realized something. She had spent days believing she was simply visiting another country. But someone else saw her differently. Someone saw her as a potential political weapon. Someone was afraid of what she might say. And perhaps worse, someone was afraid of what people might believe after hearing her. The following morning, Marilyn was informed that her schedule had changed. "Why?" she asked. "Security reasons." "Who changed it?" Nobody answered. Her translator looked uncomfortable. Marilyn understood. Something was happening behind the scenes. She asked to visit a public market. The request was denied. She asked to walk through the city. Denied. She asked to meet ordinary citizens without officials present. Denied. Marilyn became angry. Why? The answer was always the same. Security. Finally, she turned toward her translator. Security. She laughed bitterly. Or control? The translator looked down. He didn't answer. Marilyn understood. That afternoon, she stood at the hotel window again. Below her, people had gathered. They were waiting. She could see flowers, photographs, children, people waving. Marilyn wanted to go outside, but security wouldn't let her. She watched the crowd from behind the glass, and something inside her broke. She whispered, "They came to see me." Then she looked at the door. "Why won't you let me see them?" Nobody answered. She stepped closer to the window. A little girl in the crowd looked upward. Their eyes met through the glass. The girl waved. Marilyn waved back. The girl smiled. Marilyn smiled too. And then, Marilyn pressed her hand against the glass. The little girl raised her hand and placed it against the air on the other side. For a moment, the glass between them looked like another version of the Iron Curtain. Two people separated by something neither of them had created. Marilyn's eyes filled with tears. She whispered, "I'm sorry." That evening, the same Soviet official returned. He entered the room. Marilyn didn't greet him. She simply looked at him. "You're afraid of me." He stopped. "What?" "You heard me." He sat down.
Why would I be afraid of an actress?
Marilyn looked at him. Because I'm not saying what you expected. The official remained silent. Marilyn continued. You wanted me to see your country. I have. You wanted me to meet your people. I have. So why are you afraid of what I saw? The official stared at her. Then he said something that Marilyn would remember for the rest of her life. Because people can forgive an enemy, he paused, but they cannot fear someone they have learned to love. Marilyn said nothing. The words stayed in the room, and suddenly she understood. The real battle had never been about Marilyn. It was about what happened when people from opposite sides discovered that they weren't strangers after all. The official stood. You will leave soon. Marilyn looked at him. Is that a request? No. A warning? He didn't answer. Marilyn walked toward the window. The city was dark again. She looked down at the streets, then quietly said, I came here thinking I would see the Soviet Union. She turned. But I didn't. The official looked confused. What did you see? Marilyn smiled sadly. People. She paused. And now, her eyes hardened. I'm afraid I'm going to miss them. The official looked at her for several seconds, then he left. The door closed. Marilyn stood alone, and for the first time since arriving in Moscow, she understood the true price of crossing the Iron Curtain. She had entered the Soviet Union as a Hollywood star, but she was beginning to leave it as something far more dangerous. A witness. And she had seen something neither government wanted the world to see, that behind every flag there was a human face. And once you had seen that face, it became much harder to call.
The next morning, Marilyn Monroe was told to leave. No explanation, no long goodbye, no final walk through Moscow, just a short message. Your visit is over.
Marilyn stood silently. For several seconds, she didn't answer. Then she looked toward the window. Thousands of people were still outside, waiting, holding flowers, holding photographs, waiting for one final glimpse of the woman they had seen only on screens. Marilyn turned toward her translator. Can I go outside? He hesitated. I don't think they'll allow it. Marilyn looked at him. Then ask. He did. The answer came quickly. No. Marilyn closed her eyes. For a moment, she looked almost defeated. Then she walked toward the window. Down below, the crowd was moving, and suddenly, she saw the little girl. The same girl who had given her the flower. The child was standing beside her mother, looking upward, searching for Marilyn. Marilyn placed her hand against the glass. The girl saw her and lifted her own hand.
Marilyn smiled. The little girl smiled back. No words, no translator, no government, no ideology, just two human beings separated by a window. And Marilyn whispered, Goodbye. A few hours later, the automobile carrying Marilyn moved through the streets of Moscow. She watched the city one final time. The buildings, the streets, the people, the faces. Everything looked different now. When she first arrived, Moscow had seemed mysterious, cold, almost frightening. Now it looked familiar. Not because she understood the country, she didn't, but because she had begun to understand something more important: the people. She had seen a mother worrying about her child, a young actress trembling before a performance, a little girl offering a flower, a stranger crying simply because she had finally seen someone she knew from a movie. These moments had nothing to do with politics. They had nothing to do with presidents, nothing to do with armies, nothing to do with missiles. They were human, and Marilyn knew she would never forget them.
At the airport, Marilyn stopped before boarding. The translator stood beside her. She looked back toward Moscow. "Do you think they'll remember me?" He smiled. "I think so." Marilyn shook her head. "No." She looked toward the crowd. "They'll remember the movie star." She paused. "I hope they remember the person." The translator looked at her. "They will." Marilyn smiled. Then she walked toward the aircraft. But before stepping inside, she turned around one final time. She waved. The crowd waved back. And for several seconds, nobody cared that she was American. Nobody cared that they were Soviet. Nobody cared about the Cold War. They simply watched a woman leave. Inside the aircraft, Marilyn sat beside the window. The engines began to roar. The city slowly disappeared beneath her. She watched until Moscow became nothing more than distant lights. Then she closed her eyes and remembered the little girl. The flower, the theater, the applause, the frightened young actress, the official who had warned her, and the words, "People can forgive an enemy, but they cannot fear someone they have learned to love." Marilyn opened her eyes. Maybe that was the real reason governments feared human contact, because once you met someone, it became harder to hate them. When Marilyn returned to America, the world wanted answers. Reporters wanted to know what she had seen. What did she think of the Soviet Union? Was it frightening? Was it beautiful? Did she meet Soviet officials? Did they try to influence her? Was she impressed? Was she disappointed? Everyone wanted a political statement. Everyone wanted a headline. But Marilyn didn't give them what they expected. She simply said, "I met people." The reporters waited. She continued, "And they were people." That answer confused them. One reporter asked, "Do you mean you think Americans and Soviets are the same?" Marilyn smiled. "No." She paused. "I mean, they're human." Another reporter asked, "Did your opinion of the Soviet Union change?" Marilyn thought for a moment, then answered, "My opinion of people changed." The room became quiet, and for a moment, nobody knew what to ask next. Years later, people would remember Marilyn Monroe for many things: her films, her photographs, her voice, her smile, her beauty, her fame, her tragic life. But very few people would remember the imagined journey behind the Iron Curtain. And perhaps that's because history usually remembers political leaders, presidents, generals, revolutions, wars, treaties. But sometimes history is changed by something much smaller: a handshake, a smile, a flower, a conversation. A moment when two people realize they aren't as different as they were told. And Marilyn Monroe understood that. She had entered Moscow as a symbol, America's blonde icon, Hollywood's most recognizable face, a woman the world believed it already understood. But she left with something no studio could give her: perspective. She had discovered that the world was much larger than Hollywood, that the people on the other side of the Iron Curtain weren't simply characters in a political story. They had families, dreams, fears, love, loss, hope. And they were just as complicated as the people she had known in America. Perhaps that was why the journey affected her so deeply, because Marilyn had spent her entire life being reduced to an image. And in Moscow, she had finally learned not to do the same thing to others. There is an irony at the heart of Marilyn Monroe's story. The woman who was constantly watched was desperate to see. The woman whose face was recognized everywhere wanted to recognize other people. The woman millions believed they knew wanted to know someone else. And the woman who became one of America's greatest symbols discovered that symbols could become prisons. Marilyn Monroe didn't need to change the Soviet Union. She didn't need to change America. She didn't need to end the Cold War.
She only needed to do one thing: look at people without seeing the label first. And perhaps that was enough. Years passed. The Cold War continued. Governments changed. Leaders came and went. The Iron Curtain eventually disappeared. But the human moments remained. The little girl with the flower, the young actress backstage, the crowded theater, the woman who cried when she finally saw Marilyn, the people standing beneath the Moscow sky. All of them had seen the same thing, not the political symbol, not the American propaganda image, not the Hollywood fantasy. They had seen a woman who smiled, a woman who was nervous, a woman who asked questions, a woman who listened, a woman who wanted to understand. And perhaps, for a few brief moments, they allowed Marilyn to see them too. But there is one final image. Imagine Marilyn standing alone beside the Moscow window on her last night. The city is silent. Snow is beginning to fall. Thousands of lights glow in the distance. She looks at them. Every light represents a home. Every home contains a story. Every story belongs to someone. And Marilyn realizes something. The world had spent years telling her what people were. Americans, Soviets, enemies, allies, rich, poor, famous, unknown. But the longer she looked, the less those labels seemed to matter. Because beneath every label was the same fragile thing: a human being. Someone who wanted to be loved, someone who wanted to belong, someone who wanted to be understood. Just like her. Marilyn slowly smiles. And perhaps for the first time in her life, she isn't thinking about how the world sees her. She's thinking about how she sees the world. That is the part of Marilyn Monroe's story that history can easily miss. The world knew her face, but it didn't know her heart. Millions wanted her. Millions photographed her. Millions watched her movies. Millions dreamed about her. Yet behind all of that fame was a woman who wanted something incredibly simple. She wanted to be seen. Not as Marilyn Monroe, not as the blonde bombshell, not as the Hollywood goddess, not as America's symbol, but as a human being. And perhaps that's why the image of Marilyn behind the Iron Curtain is so powerful. Because the woman who had spent her life being looked at finally became the one who looked back. She looked through the cameras, through the borders, through the propaganda, through the fear. And what she found on the other side wasn't a monster. It wasn't an enemy. It wasn't a political slogan. It was a little girl holding a flower. A young actress afraid to step onto a stage, a mother crying, a crowd applauding, a stranger smiling, a city full of ordinary people. People. And maybe that was the greatest thing Marilyn Monroe could have brought back from Moscow. Not a political victory, not a diplomatic agreement, not a headline, but a simple truth. The Iron Curtain could divide countries. It could divide governments. It could divide armies. But it could never completely divide human beings. Because somewhere beneath every flag, there is still a heart. And somewhere beneath every famous face, there is still a person. Marilyn Monroe knew what it meant to become a symbol. Perhaps that is why she understood the danger of turning other people into symbols too. She had been called beautiful, dangerous, irresistible, American, Hollywood, a legend. But beneath every name, she was simply Marilyn, a woman who wanted to be loved, a woman who wanted to be understood, a woman who, for one brief moment, crossed an invisible wall
and discovered that on the other side, people were not so different after all. And maybe that is the Marilyn Monroe the world should remember. Not the woman beneath the spotlight, not the woman on the movie poster, but the woman standing beside a cold Moscow window, looking at thousands of distant lights and finally realizing the world had spent her entire life looking at her. But she had spent one